I didn't discover her betrayal in a dramatic way. There was no lipstick on a collar, no late-night phone call answered in whispers, no confession soaked in tears. It was quieter than that, almost polite. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten thousands of dinners, argued about nothing, planned vacations we never took. Morning light spilled across the wood, catching dust in the air. Her phone lay face down beside my coffee mug. It vibrated once, then again. She was in the shower. I didn't mean to look. That's the lie I still tell myself. The truth is more uncomfortable. Curiosity had been growing in me for months, a low-grade itch I pretended not to feel. I told myself it was stress, age, work, anything but intuition. The screen lit up when I turned it over, a name I didn't recognize, a message preview. Last night was hard to forget. That was all. No explicit words, no proof really, just a sentence that didn't belong in my life. I stared at it longer than I should have, as if meaning would rearrange itself into something harmless if I waited. My chest tightened, not with pain at first, but with confusion. My mind began doing what it had always done best, protecting me from reality. Probably a joke, a coworker, something taken out of context. I put the phone back exactly where it was, aligning it with the edge of the table. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't notice. I listened to the sound of the shower, the familiar rhythm of water against tile. For a moment, everything looked the same. That was the most frightening part. The rest of the day passed like a poorly dubbed film. She talked. I answered. Words came out of my mouth without permission. I watched her face as if it belonged to a stranger who had memorized my wife's expressions. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every touch felt delayed. That night, lying beside her in bed, I counted her breaths. I had done that before, years ago when we were younger, when intimacy still felt like discovery instead of routine. Back then, counting her breaths made me feel close. Now it felt like surveillance. Sleep didn't come. Instead, memories did. Small things at first, harmless things, or so I had thought. Her sudden interest in running again, after years of complaining about her knees. New lingerie that made her feel confident, worn on days I knew I'd be home late. A shift in the way she laughed, lighter, quicker, less patient with me. At the time I had felt proud, relieved, grateful that she was finding herself again. Now those memories rearranged themselves into a different shape. The shock didn't arrive as an explosion. It was erosion, a slow grinding away of certainty. I didn't confront her, not then. I needed to understand what I was feeling first, and that turned out to be harder than I expected. Betrayal isn't a single emotion, it's a crowded room. There was anger, sharp and hot, but beneath it sat humiliation, a quiet, suffocating sense of being foolish, of having played my role too well, the reliable husband, the stable presence, while something else grew in the shadows. I asked myself questions I had never dared to ask before. Was I boring? Was I absent? Was I replaceable? Each question felt like a small act of self-violence. Over the next few weeks, I became an observer in my own marriage. I noticed patterns, timelines, gaps. She guarded her phone now, though she claimed she always had. She angled the screen away from me, took calls on the balcony, smiled at messages, and then quickly erased the evidence of that smile. And I did nothing. Not because I was weak, but because I was afraid of what confirmation would do to me. As long as everything remained theoretical, I could still pretend I was in control. Control, I would later learn, is often just denial with better posture. At night, while she slept, I replayed conversations from years past, arguments I thought we had resolved, silences I had misread as peace. I began to see how often I had chosen comfort over truth, How often I had ignored the uneasy feeling in my gut because it threatened the story I wanted to believe. We had built a life together, not a perfect one but a functional one, shared accounts, shared friends, shared routines that filled the days so completely there was little room left to question anything. And yet, somewhere inside that structure, a parallel life had found space to exist. The first real crack came not from her phone, but from a memory. I was driving home from work when I remembered a night from 2 years earlier. We had been sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the television on, volume low. She had been distracted, restless. When I asked her what was wrong, she said nothing. "I'm just tired," she'd said. "Can we talk tomorrow?" Tomorrow never came. At the time, I accepted that. I had accepted a lot of things. Now I wondered who she had been talking to instead. That thought settled into me like a parasite. I stopped touching her. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. Every kiss felt like a lie my body refused to participate in. She noticed, of course, asked if I was stressed, suggested a weekend away. I nodded, agreed, played my part. Inside, something was hardening. I began to prepare, not for confrontation but for distance. Emotional distance first. I stopped sharing my thoughts, my fears, my plans. I listened more than I spoke, storing information away like evidence in a case I hadn't yet decided to open. Sleep became a battlefield. Nights stretched long and empty. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing conversations that never happened. In some versions, she cried. In others, she was relieved. In the worst ones, she didn't care at all. That possibility haunted me more than the affair itself. What I didn't expect was how lonely dignity could be. There was no one I could talk to, not without breaking the illusion of normalcy I was still clinging to. Friends saw us as solid, dependable, the kind of couple people pointed to as proof that marriage could work. I had helped build that image. Now I was trapped inside it. Every morning I put on the same mask and went to work. I performed competence, confidence. Meanwhile, my inner world was collapsing, room by room. I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, I planned. Not revenge, not yet, just understanding, just clarity. Because if something was going to end, I needed to know exactly what I was ending. One evening, she asked me if I was okay. The question landed between us like a loaded weapon. I looked at her for a long moment, really looked. The woman I had loved for most of my adult life. The woman who knew my habits, my weaknesses, my history, or at least the version of her I thought I knew. "I'm just tired," I said. She smiled, relieved. And in that smile, I saw the final confirmation of something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. Whatever we were, it was already broken. The fracture had happened long before I found that message. I had simply been late to the sound of it. There is a strange cruelty in memory. It does not announce itself. It waits until you are weak, then offers you fragments, out of order, out of context, and dares you to assemble the truth. Once the fracture existed, everything before it demanded re-examination. I started with the ordinary days, the ones that had felt safe, routine, unremarkable. I replayed them slowly, as if lowering a needle onto an old record, listening for distortions I had missed the first time. Breakfasts where she seemed distracted. Evenings where her laughter arrived too late. Moments when I spoke and felt unheard, but told myself it was normal. Long marriages, I believed, were built on tolerance. Now I wondered what else tolerance had allowed to grow. I became methodical. Not like a detective chasing drama, but like an archivist restoring damaged documents. I kept everything in my head: dates, shifts in behavior, emotional inconsistencies. She used to tell me everything, or so I thought. Somewhere along the way, our conversations had become logistical instead of intimate. "Did you pay the bill? What time will you be home? Can you pick up milk? The deeper questions had vanished quietly, without protest. I remembered the first time she didn't look me in the eyes when she said she loved me. It had been brief, subtle, so subtle that I dismissed it as fatigue. Fatigue is such a useful excuse. At night, while she slept beside me, I constructed timelines. I thought about the changes in her schedule, how often work required late hours, how new colleagues suddenly had names and personalities she shared with enthusiasm, except for one, the unnamed one. There had always been a gap where details should have been. I remembered asking once, half joking, "So who's making you smile at your phone these days?" She laughed too quickly. "You're paranoid." I had laughed too. That laughter echoed now, hollow and misplaced. What surprised me most wasn't the betrayal itself, but how easily it fit once I allowed it to exist. Like a missing puzzle piece snapping into place. Suddenly, the emotional distance made sense. The irritation, the impatience with my presence, the way she had begun to treat me like an obstacle instead of a partner. I wasn't competing with another man. I was competing with a version of herself that no longer included me. There is a particular humiliation in realizing you have been edited out of someone's inner life. Not erased, just reduced, a background character, necessary but unimportant. I stopped asking questions, not because I didn't want answers, but because I was done revealing my ignorance. Instead, I listened. I noticed how she spoke about loyalty in abstract terms, how she criticized friends who cheated while carefully avoiding specifics, how she framed herself as someone who valued honesty, even as her life became an exercise in omission. Her lies weren't grand, they were small, daily, cumulative. That made them worse. The nights grew heavier. I lay awake, replaying old arguments, hearing them differently now. Where I had once heard frustration, I now heard justification. Where I had heard silence, I now heard concealment. I spoke to myself in the dark, quietly, as if afraid my thoughts might wake her. You trusted her. You built a life. You weren't careless, you were committed. I needed to believe that, because the alternative, that I had been naive, was harder to bear. There came a moment I hadn't anticipated. A moment of calm. It arrived one afternoon while I was sitting alone in my car, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. I had nowhere to go, nothing urgent to do. And suddenly, the anger stepped aside. In its place was clarity. I understood then that I wasn't trying to save the marriage. I was trying to save my sense of self, my dignity, my narrative. I didn't want explanations. I wanted symmetry. If she had lived a double life, then I would no longer live transparently inside hers. That was when I began to withdraw, not visibly but internally. I stopped reacting, stopped offering reassurance, stopped filling silences. When she spoke, I listened with polite distance, no longer seeking validation in her responses. She noticed. People always notice when the balance shifts. "Are you mad at me?" she asked one evening. "No," I said truthfully. Madness implies chaos. What I felt was order. I started reclaiming parts of myself I had neglected. I stayed late at work, not to escape her but to feel competent again, useful, autonomous. I reconnected with friends I had slowly drifted from, not to complain, but to remember who I had been before my identity merged entirely with hers. She interpreted this as growth. That irony almost made me smile. The truth revealed itself gradually, not through confrontation, but through contrast. I watched how she responded to my absence, how little effort she made to bridge the gap, how quickly she adjusted. That told me everything I needed to know. Love does not adapt easily to loss. There is a moment in every disintegration where you stop asking why and start asking what now. Mine came late one night, when I realized I no longer cared whether she confessed. Confession would have been for her conscience. What I needed was resolution. And resolution, I understood, would not come from her words, but from my choices. I began to imagine futures. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness. Futures where I was no longer reacting to her decisions, but authoring my own. In some of those futures, I exposed the truth, not loudly, not cruelly, but cleanly. In others, I disappeared from her life with surgical precision, leaving behind only the echo of what she had underestimated. I didn't know yet which path I would choose. But I knew this. I would not beg. I would not plead. I would not break. If something was going to end, it would end on my terms. One morning, as she left for work, she kissed me on the cheek. It was habitual, automatic. I stood still as her lips touched my skin. And for the first time since the fracture, I felt nothing. That was when I understood the most dangerous truth of all. I was no longer the injured party. I was becoming the unknown variable. There is a point where pain exhausts itself. It doesn't disappear. It simply stops demanding attention. That's when control begins. I no longer measured my days by her moods. I stopped anticipating her reactions, stopped adjusting my tone to keep the peace. The emotional choreography we had perfected over years dissolved, and with it, her quiet authority over my inner state. She sensed it before she understood it. People who live behind masks grow anxious when the audience stops responding. "You're different," she said one night, not accusing, not gentle, uncertain. Different. As if the previous version of me had been a setting she could adjust. "I'm thinking," I replied. It was the most honest answer I had given her in months. I began to prepare in ways she could not see. Not documents and lawyers, at least not yet. First, I prepared psychologically. I imagined the moment of truth until it lost its power over me. I rehearsed it so thoroughly that the words themselves became dull, stripped of their ability to wound. "I know." "How long?" "Who is he?" Eventually, I stopped caring about the answers. What mattered was not the details, but the imbalance, the way she believed herself protected by my restraint. That belief would not survive. I started noticing how careless she had become. Not with evidence, but with empathy. She spoke freely about her exhaustion, her dissatisfaction, her desire for something more, never once considering that I might hear those words differently now. She framed herself as someone trapped in a life that no longer fit. And I realized something quietly devastating. In her internal story, I was already the villain. That realization freed me. If I was already guilty in her mind, there was no reason left to perform innocence. I chose my moment carefully. Control is not about speed, it is about timing. The opportunity came on an ordinary evening. No raised voices, no dramatic setting, just the two of us at the table, eating in silence. I didn't accuse her. I asked the question, "Do you think honesty always matters?" I said casually, as if discussing philosophy. She looked up, surprised, hesitated for half a second too long. "Of course," she said. "Why?" I nodded, took another bite, let the silence stretch. That silence did more damage than any confrontation could have. From that point on, I let her unravel herself. I withdrew affection completely, not in anger but in neutrality. I treated her with polite distance, the kind reserved for colleagues or acquaintances. No warmth, no hostility, just absence. She tried to compensate at first. Small gestures, forced intimacy, questions that were really traps. "Are you seeing someone else?" she asked once, half joking. "No," I said. And again it was true. I didn't need another person. I needed separation. The night she confessed was almost anticlimactic. She chose it, not me. People often do when they realize their secrets have lost their leverage. "I need to tell you something," she said, voice trembling, eyes glossy with rehearsed remorse. I said nothing. That silence unsettled her more than anger ever could. She spoke, explained, rationalized, apologized. I watched her carefully, not as a husband, but as an observer of human behavior. I noted where her voice cracked, where it didn't, which details she emphasized, which she avoided. It wasn't love that motivated her confession. It was fear. Fear of losing control. When she finished, she waited. For forgiveness. For outrage. For collapse. Instead, I asked one question. "Do you think you would have told me if you hadn't felt me pulling away?" She didn't answer. That answer told me everything. I didn't expose her publicly. I didn't need to. True power doesn't announce itself. I made my decisions quietly. I separated our finances, changed my routines, redefined my boundaries. I began planning a future that did not include her emotional chaos. She sensed the shift immediately. "What are you doing?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I'm taking responsibility for my life," I said. That frightened her more than any threat could have. She tried everything then. Guilt, seduction, tears, promises. Each attempt confirmed the same truth. She wanted relief, not repair. I gave her neither. The final act of control was not revenge. It was exposure, not to others but to herself. I told her calmly that I would not fight for someone who had already left, that I would not compete with a fantasy she had chosen over reality. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I don't trust you, and without trust there is nothing left to negotiate." Those words landed heavily. Not because they were cruel, but because they were final. That night I slept for the first time in months. Not because the pain was gone, but because it was no longer running the narrative. There is a peculiar sound that follows an ending. Not the sound of doors slamming or voices raised, but the absence that comes after everything has already been said. A vacuum where meaning used to circulate. That was what filled the apartment in the weeks that followed. We moved around each other like carefully placed furniture, polite, distant, functioning. Two people honoring a structure that no longer served either of us, because tearing it down required more energy than we were willing to spend. She cried less than I expected. That too told me something. I didn't rush the departure. Leaving too quickly would have looked like escape. I wanted it to look like a decision. I slept in the guest room, not as punishment for either of us, but as a declaration. Physical distance is sometimes the first honest thing two people can offer each other. At night, alone, I listened to the sounds of the building. Pipes, elevators, the muted lives of other people continuing uninterrupted. I realized how small our private catastrophe really was. And yet how absolute. She tried one last time. Not with apologies this time, but with nostalgia. "Do you remember when we first moved in here?" she asked, standing in the doorway one evening. "We didn't even have a table. We ate on the floor." "I remember," I said. I remembered everything. Memory was no longer the problem. Attachment was. There was no dramatic final conversation. Just a morning where I packed a single bag and told her I'd be staying elsewhere for a while. Not forever, not never, just elsewhere. She asked if this was punishment. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said, "this is alignment." She didn't understand that word in this context. That was okay. Leaving did not feel like victory. It felt like neutrality. Like setting something down after carrying it for too long, then realizing how heavy it had been only once it was no longer in your hands. The first nights alone were quiet to the point of discomfort. No one else's breathing, no shared rhythms, just space. And for the first time in a long while, my thoughts were uninterrupted. I expected anger to return. It didn't. What returned instead was curiosity. Who was I without the role I had been performing? Without the compromises I had mistaken for maturity? Without the constant calibration to someone else's emotional weather? I noticed small things. How easily I breathed. How deeply I slept. How little I checked my phone. I had mistaken intensity for connection for years. Now I understood the difference. She reached out occasionally. Messages that tested boundaries without crossing them. I hope you're okay. I've been thinking about you. We built something real, didn't we? I didn't respond immediately, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer felt obligated to manage her feelings. When I did reply, I kept it brief, kind, final. We had built something real, and it had ended. The true revenge, if it could even be called that, was not her pain. It was her uncertainty. I gave her no villain to fight, no emotional chaos to justify her choices, no dramatic rage she could frame as the reason everything fell apart. Only composure, only clarity, only absence. People rarely regret what they do in moments of passion. They regret what they do when faced with silence. Months passed. Life reorganized itself around me. New routines, new spaces, new versions of quiet. I learned that peace is not loud, not euphoric. It doesn't announce itself. It simply remains. Occasionally I thought of her, not with longing but with a detached recognition, like remembering a former address, a place that once mattered but no longer did. I wondered if she thought of me the same way. I suspected not. The final decision came without ceremony. I signed the papers on an ordinary afternoon. No trembling hands, no dramatic pause, just a pen moving across a page. The legal end of something that had been emotionally over for a long time. When I left the office, the sky was clear, the kind of clear that feels intentional. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, just breathing. People ask sometimes if I forgave her. I never know how to answer that. Forgiveness implies a moral transaction. What I did was simpler. I stopped participating in a story that required my diminishment. The last time I saw her, months later, we spoke briefly, cordially, like two people who once shared a language neither of us speaks anymore. She looked at me as if searching for something. Validation. Regret. Permission. I offered none. Just a nod, a polite goodbye. And then I left. What stayed with me was not the betrayal. It was the realization that love without respect becomes a negotiation. That loyalty without awareness becomes self-erasure. That the most devastating response to being betrayed is not revenge, but self-restoration. Some endings burn. This one faded. And in that fading, I found something unexpected. Freedom not as a triumph, but as a quiet, enduring state. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. The kind that answers the only question that ever really mattered. What is more frightening, punishment or indifference? I already knew the answer. And so did she.